Hello everyone, welcome to another video. This time I want to show you how networking and VNet integration works with Managed DevOps Pools. In Azure we want to keep our resources secure, and one way to do this is to remove all the public access. This means we can only access them over a private VNet connection. For example, a database or a key vault that our web service uses doesn't need to be available from the internet. The problem with this approach is that we have to find a solution how we deploy to these private resources. For example, if you use a Microsoft hosted agent, the agent comes from the internet and therefore doesn't have access. Back in the days, we had to use VMs, create a VNet, configure the VM with the VNet, and then we're able to access the private resources. But now with Managed DevOps Pools, I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up a private network and how to add it to the Managed DevOps Pool. So let's take a look what we are going to do today. First, we're going to create a new VNet and subnet. Then we're going to create an Azure Key Vault and also configure the access to the Key Vault. Then we create a private endpoint and a private DNS for this Key Vault. This means we attach the Key Vault to our VNet and give it a private IP address. Then we're going to deploy our Managed DevOps Pool, and we also attach the VNet to the Managed DevOps Pool. And in the end, we're going to test it with a pipeline that tries to read and write secrets from the Key Vault over the private connection. And with this, let's switch to the terminal and let's get started. First, let's define a couple variables. So these are very basic variables. That's the resource group name, the location, the name for our VNet and our subnet, and the subscription ID. Then we're going to define the variables for our Managed DevOps Pool. So that's the name for the Managed DevOps Pool, the Dev Center name, and the Dev Center project. And if you've never used Managed DevOps Pool before, I will link a video where I explain all the steps, because I might go over them a bit quickly today. But in this video, you will see everything, how it works, how to set it up, and all the details. And lastly, we're going to define a couple of variables for the Key Vault. That's the name for the Key Vault, the name for the secret, which we're going to use to test the connection, the name for the private endpoint, and the name for the private DNS. And the only important part here is the Key Vault name, because it has to be unique worldwide. So if you try to do this demo yourself, you have to change this name. As always, I will link a GitHub where you have all the commands, so you can just copy paste them from there. With this in place, we can get started with the deployments. So first, we're going to create a resource group. And this resource group will contain all our resources we are going to create today. Next up, we are going to create our VNet. It's just a simple AC network VNet create command, the resource group, VNet name, the location, the subnet name, and then we provide the IP address for the VNet and for the subnet. So let's deploy this. This should only take a couple seconds. And once this is deployed, we are going to create another subnet, and the additional subnet will contain our Managed DevOps Pools. So the VNet is deployed. Let's clean this up. And here we're going to create a subnet. So it's the AC network VNet subnet create command with the resource group name, a name for the subnet, the name of the VNet. This time we use a different prefix. So here you can use whatever you want, except the one you used in the last subnet. And here, this part is the important one, the delegation. So we have to delegate the subnet to our Managed DevOps Pools. This means only Managed DevOps Pools can use the subnet. Therefore, we have to create a separate one. And I'm also querying the ID of the subnet because we're going to need it in the next couple steps. So let's create this. This again should only take a couple seconds, and that's already finished. Next up, we have to give the infrastructure of our DevOps Managed DevOps Pool access to the subnet. And as I explained in my last video, when you create a Managed DevOps pool, or actually before you create one, you have to register two providers. And one of the provider in Azure is the DevOps infrastructure provider. And this provider creates a managed identity or a service principal. Now we have to give the service principal access to our subnet. To do this, we use the AC AD SP list, SP for service principal command. And this command gives us the ID of our service principal of the DevOps infrastructure. So if you take a look, we see here the ID. And with this ID, we can assign now the roles to the VNet for the service principal. So we use the AC role assignment create command. We provide the ID we just queried. Then we provide the role as reader, and the scope is our VNet. So if you follow along with the commands, you don't have to change anything, because if you scroll up, we got the subscription ID dynamically. So it reads out your subscription ID, and it also uses variables for all the other commands. So once this is created, we have to create a second role assignment. That's again for the same service principal, but this time we have to use the network contributor role, and again for the same VNet. So it should take a couple seconds. So now the infrastructure of the Managed DevOps pool has access to the VNet. With this in place, we can now create our Azure Key Vault. So we again use the same resource group. We provide the name for the Key Vault, the location. Then here we say we want to use RBAC for the authorization. This means we can just use Azure permissions or RBAC roles to access the Key Vault. Then we're going to disable the public network access, because we want to use our private connection to keep all our secrets secure, and therefore we're going to disable this. And the last one here is a bit of a tricky one, because if you disable the public network access, I think by default, Microsoft enables a setting that says allow Azure resources or services to access this resource. This sounds great, but the problem is Azure services means all Azure services, not just in your subscription or tenant. This means from somebody outside, they could also access your Key Vault. Obviously, they need the permissions, but this means the Key Vault is not fully private. Therefore, we set this setting to none. I'm also going to show you in the Azure portal in a couple minutes. There it's easier to understand if you have never seen it before. The last thing we want to configure for our Key Vault is the permission for the service connection of my Azure DevOps. So I'm going to paste the command, and then we take a look how it works. Here again, we're using the AC role assignment create command, then the role the Key Vault secrets officer. This role has the permissions to read and write secrets, because the pipeline should write the secret and also read one. Then the assignee is the ID of my service connection. I'm going to show you in a second how we can get this connection ID. And then as the scope, we set the Key Vault. So while this is being created, let's switch over to our Azure DevOps server. Here in my project, I click on the bottom right to the project settings. And inside this project settings, I have service connections. So if I open these service connections, I only have one. And that's the service connection I'm going to use in my demo pipeline. If I open this one, I see here an ID, and all the way down I can say here Manage App Registration. This opens the Azure portal. There I can see all the IDs, like the client ID and the object ID. And for the role assignment, we need the application client ID. So if you zoom in a little bit, we're using this one. So it starts with 7B45. And if we go back to our terminal, scroll up a bit, here we also are using the 7B45. This means our service connection now has access to the Key Vault. So let's clean this up. And next we're going to configure the private endpoint and the private DNS zone. But before we're going to do this, I want to switch over to the Azure portal and just show to you how it will work, what we're going to do, because I think it's easier to understand in the Azure portal. Here in the Azure portal, we have our one resource group. If we open this one, we should find our Key Vault here. Then we open this one. And on the left side, we have here the networking tab. If we open this one, we can see here the public access has been disabled. And also this setting, they allow trusted Microsoft services to bypass this firewall. This was the bypass parameter we provided during the deployment. This means no Azure service has access to our Key Vault except the ones inside our VNet. So now we have set up the Key Vault. We removed the private access, the public access. Now we want to add a private access or connection. And to do this, we are using a private endpoint. In the Azure portal, it's quite easy. So just go on private endpoint connections. We click on create. Then we provide a name. For example, my private endpoint, region. Then we select what type of service we want to attach this private endpoint to. In our case, we want to use a Key Vault. So we search for vaults or Microsoft Key Vault /vaults. Then the resource, since we only have one Key Vault, we can only select one from the list. And the target sub-resource is already selected as Key Vault. Then for the VNet, it automatically selects the VNet we created before because we only have one. The same with the subnet. Here we have the one subnet we're using, and the second subnet, it says incompatible subnet because we delegated it to our Managed DevOps Pool. This means the Key Vault can't use it. On the next tab, we can create a private DNS zone, or we can, to be precise, just configure the name of the DNS zone and where it should reside. So it's the same resource group. Then we can add some tags, and then we can create everything. Doing this in the Azure portal works. It's easy, especially if you want to learn something new, but I want to do it in the terminal because this is way easier to reproduce. You can just copy the commands, and overall we should strive to have everything as in. So let's switch back to the terminal and create everything I just showed you. Back in the terminal, first let's create a private DNS zone. So use the AC network private DNS zone create command. We provide the resource group and the name for the DNS zone. That's the same name the Azure portal would use if you did the creation in the Azure portal. Creating the DNS zone should only take around a minute. And after this is created, we can now link our VNet to the private DNS zone. To do this, we use AC network private DNS link VNet create. We provide the resource group name, the name of our VNet, the name of our private DNS. Then we provide a name for the connection. I just use the same VNet name again. And I'm enabling the registration. This means all the resources inside this VNet will automatically be added to the DNS. And you don't have to configure them, they just use it. This link is necessary, otherwise the resources inside of the VNet wouldn't be able to use the private DNS. And the private DNS is necessary because we have a private connection and we still want to use the name of our Key Vault. We just don't want to use private IP addresses. Therefore, we need the DNS resolution. This again should only take a couple seconds, maybe a minute. While I say this, the deployment is finished. So let's clean up this. Next, we're going to create our private endpoint. We're going to use the AC network private endpoint create command, and we provide almost all the variables we've defined so far. So the resource group, location, VNet name, subnet name, a name for a private endpoint, the connection resource ID, that's the ID to our key vault. Then down here, the group ID for vault, that's exactly the same what we configured or selected in the Azure portal, and then a connection name. So let's create this. This should only take a couple seconds. The private endpoint has been created, and the last step we have is to add this private endpoint to our DNS zone. So let's clean up the window again and paste the command. And to configure the private endpoint with the DNS zone, we use the AC network private endpoint DNS zone group create command. This means we create a DNS zone group, and this group takes care of all the management. This means we don't have to create an A record set with the IP address of our network card in the DNS zone. Everything is done by the DNS zone group. To do this, we provide a name. I use default because that's the name the Azure portal would use. Then the name of our private endpoint, of our DNS zone, and of our resource group. So let's create this. And after this is finished, we'll switch back to the Azure portal, and then we can see what we have created. So there we should see our private endpoint and a connection between the DNS zone and this private endpoint. So it only took a couple seconds. Everything is set up. So now let's switch over to the Azure portal. Here in the Azure portal, we see all the resources we have created. So we have our private endpoint, the network interface for the private endpoint, and our private DNS zone. If you open the Key Vault and then we scroll back down to networking and the private endpoint connections tab, there we can also see the private endpoint we just created. If we click on this private endpoint, we can see the whole configuration of this private endpoint. For example, on the left here under DNS configuration, we can see the IP address of our private endpoint and also the link to the DNS zone. And we didn't have to configure anything, like we didn't have to set up the IP address or an A record, because the DNS zone group, the one we created in the last step, took care of all of this. To show that everything works, let's open the DNS zone. And on the left side, we select record sets. There we have two records, so the default one and the second one is the A record of the private endpoint. And this one was created by the DNS zone group. We could also do it by hand, but then we would have to figure out what is the IP address of our network card and then update it. And the DNS zone group took care of everything. So with this in place, we have configured the entire network, the private key vault. The last resource that's left is our Managed DevOps Pool. So let's switch back to the terminal and create this one. Back in the terminal, let's first create a dev center. This dev center takes care of the infrastructure. This means it acquires a new agent, provisions it, and takes care of the resources. Again, I will link the video to the whole explanation where I set up the Managed DevOps Pool step by step and explain everything down in the description. This should only take maybe 2 to 3 minutes, so I'm going to stop here and we'll be back once this is created. Now create the project inside this dev center, and the most important part is the ID, because we're going to need it in the next step when we create our Managed DevOps Pool. Let's create this, and this again should take 1 to 2 minutes until it's finished. The Dev Center project is created, and now as last step, we can create our Managed DevOps Pool. So here we provide all the usual variables like name and resource group. We also provide here the ID of the project, which we just created. And down here, we provide 3 files. So let's start the deployment. and then take a look at these 3 files. The first one is the agent profile. There you can configure your agent. In this case, I want a stateless agent. This means after the agent was used, it will be just deleted. And if I run another pipeline or job, a new agent will be created. Next up, the organization profile. There you configure the access and the organization. For example, you configure for which projects you want to use this Managed DevOps Pool and what the URL of your Azure DevOps server is. So that's down here in the URL. Then the projects, I say just use it for all the projects. And the parallelism as 1 means I want to run 1 agent at a time. Lastly, we have the permissions. In this case, it's creator only. This means only I as creator have the permission to change anything. But you could also use inherit from the project. This means only build administrator should have access. And there's a third option with which I can't remember right now. Lastly, we have the fabric profile. That's the most important file for now. So first we configure our agent. This means what VM are we going to use, what agent image we are going to use. So we have a small 2-core VM. We are going to use Ubuntu 22.04. And if we scroll further down, the most important part for today is this network profile. There we provide the ID of the subnet we created for the Managed DevOps Pool. If you scroll over, it's just the ID, and here we have the Managed DevOps Pool subnet at the end. So if you want to try out the demo yourself, you have to open this file and update this ID, because here your subscription will be different. And if you use different names for the subnet, for the VNet or the resource group, you will also have to update it. Before I check it into GitHub, I will make a comment there so you know what you have to update. By now, the Managed DevOps Pool should be created, so let's switch back to the terminal. And there we can see the deployment is finished. This means we have set up everything. So we have created a new VNet, a new Key Vault with only private access. We added a private endpoint and a DNS zone to this Key Vault. And lastly, we created a Managed DevOps Pool that also is integrated into this VNet. This means now we're going to use a test pipeline that will read and write secrets from the Key Vault over the private connection. So let's switch back to Azure DevOps and test our pipeline. Here in Azure DevOps, I have already prepared a pipeline. So let's run this pipeline and then we take a look what this pipeline does. Let's start it, and now let's take a look at that definition. And there you can see it's a quite simple pipeline. The most important part probably are the 2 variables on the top, because the Azure Service Connection and the Key Vault name could be different for you. And they're probably different. So you have to update the name of your service connection and the name of your Key Vault. Once you have done this, what this pipeline does is, in the first task, it creates a new secret in the Key Vault, and the secret has the value, this is a secret. Remember this because we are going to read this value and then we should see it later. Next, we're going to read all the secrets from our Key Vault. Since we only have one, we're only reading one. Then we are writing this secret into a text file. The reason why we're doing this is Azure DevOps knows that this is a secret, and therefore it doesn't let us just print it in the output. It would only give us asterisk and we can't read it. If we write it in the text file, then we can read it. Lastly, we are going to publish this text file and then we can take a look at it. By now the pipeline should be already finished. So let's go back. And there you can see the pipeline is finished. And here we have one published container. If we open this, we can see that the container is named secrets and it contains a text file also named secrets. Let's download this file. Then we open it and there we should see the value of our secret. here is the value. It says this is a secret. This is exactly what we wrote into the Key Vault. And this is everything I wanted to show you today. So today we have created a new VNet and a new Key Vault. Then we configured the VNet so we can add it to our Managed DevOps Pool. And we also created a new private endpoint and a DNS zone for the Key Vault so we can add the Key Vault to the VNet. This allows us to remove the public access to the Key Vault, therefore we keep it safe, but it also allows us to have the Key Vault and the Managed DevOps Pool in the same VNet. This means we can have our deployments still be able to access the Key Vault. At the end, we ran a pipeline, and there we saw that the pipeline still has access to the Key Vault, since both are connected over the private connection. If you want to see more content about Managed DevOps Pool and Azure and security in general, please like the video, also subscribe to the channel. I publish new videos every week. And with this, I hope to see you next week.